Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling a really big question. Can we actually trust scientific research? We're going to dive into what might be broken in the world of science, and more importantly, explore some simple, totally doable ways we can make it better.
And this question really gets right to the heart of the matter. Why is it that so many studies, even ones published in big, respected journals, are basically impossible for other scientists to reproduce? I mean, if science can't double-check its own work, that poses a huge problem for everything we think we know.
All right, so here's the game plan for today. We're going to start by looking at this credibility problem and something called the open science gap. Then we'll get into the good stuff, how to actually fix the research process, how to improve sharing and incentives, and finally, what the path to a better, more trustworthy science really looks like. So first up, what's really going on here? What's chipping away at our trust in research? Well, a lot of it boils down to a set of behaviors that make the whole scientific process way less transparent than it really should be. The main culprit here is something called questionable research practices, or QRPs for short. Now, we're not usually talking about outright fraud. Instead, these are actions that just make the research process murky, hard to see into. And the result? We get a whole bunch of published science that's filled with false positives, findings that look real but can't be replicated, which makes them misleading and, let's be honest, pretty useless. And believe me, these aren't just some abstract academic terms. They are very real things that happen. Take harking? That's basically like shooting an arrow at a barn wall and then drawing the bullseye around wherever it landed. Or p-hacking. That's like torturing your data until it finally confesses to something statistically significant. And selective reporting? That's when you only show off the one magic trick that worked, and you conveniently forget to mention the 9 that didn't. Even when it's not intentional, these practices really distort our understanding of the world. So if we know these practices are a problem, why do they keep happening? This question brings us straight to what's called the open science gap, this huge difference between knowing what we should do and what we actually do. And here's the central paradox, right? We have literally decades of knowledge on how to do good, solid, transparent science. The best practices are out there. And yet, so many of the people on the front lines, the authors, the journal editors, the reviewers, they just don't use them. There's this massive gap between what we know is best and what actually happens in practice. So why? Why is there a gap? Well, it's because researchers are people. They're making a kind of cost-benefit analysis in their heads. An author might think, well, if I'm totally transparent about my messy data, my paper might get rejected. But if they, let's say, clean up the story, maybe they can get published in a top journal. The system as it is today often rewards those flashy, surprising results more than it rewards careful, rigorous methods. Okay, enough with the problems. Let's start talking about solutions. Because the good news is there are a ton of really practical, actionable ways to fix this. And they don't require us to reinvent science from scratch. We can start right with the research process itself. First up, we have a real game changer. Preregistration. The idea is so simple. Before you even start collecting your data, you publicly post your hypothesis and your plan for analyzing it with a timestamp. This makes it impossible to to pretend you knew the result all along. And the best part? It's completely free. It takes maybe an hour using tools like the Open Science Framework, and it forces you to do better, more transparent science by clearly separating what you predicted from what you discovered later. Next up is something called registered reports, which completely flips the old publishing model on its head. Instead of writing up a whole study and then submitting it, researchers submit just their introduction and their methods for peer review before they do the work. If the reviewers agree that the question is important and the method is solid, the journal agrees to publish it right then and there. This totally removes the pressure to find a positive result and instead rewards high-quality, rigorous science, no matter what the outcome is. So fixing the process itself is a huge step, but we also have to fix the culture around it. So let's look at some solutions for how we share knowledge, what we reward, and how we train the people involved. 2 big ideas here are all about radical transparency. First, create online archives so authors can share all their study materials. And second, make it mandatory to share the data and the computer code used for analysis. This isn't just about letting people check your work, which is critical. It also helps speed up science because other researchers can build directly on what you've done instead of having to start over from square one. So you might be thinking, what's the incentive for researchers to share all this stuff they work so hard on? Well, how about this number? 97. On average, that's how many more citations an article gets when the data is made publicly available. So being open isn't some sacrifice. It actually benefits the researcher directly, with way more attention and a bigger impact. Look, if you want to change behavior, you've got to change the incentives. It really comes down to carrots and sticks. The carrots? Things like best paper awards or cool digital badges that celebrate and reward open science practices. And the sticks? That's when the funding agencies, the ones holding the purse strings, require these practices just to get a grant in the first place. Both of these help make sure we're rewarding what we say we value. But what happens if you change the rules of the game, but the referees don't know them? That's why training for journal editors and peer reviewers is so incredibly important. These are the gatekeepers of science. We have to make sure they understand these new, more transparent methods so they can evaluate them fairly. Without their buy-in, the whole system just gets stuck. So we've got the process, we've got the incentives, we've got the training. That brings us to the final and maybe the most important piece of this entire puzzle: changing the culture of science itself. This last recommendation might just be the most powerful one. It calls for editors and leaders in science to publicly declare that a study with messy data or null results, meaning it didn't find what it was looking for, is just as valuable as a study with some flashy, groundbreaking finding, as long as the methods were rigorous. This signals a huge cultural shift away from rewarding surprising stories and toward rewarding the honest search for truth. And here's the real kicker. None of these ideas are some pie-in-the-sky dream. They are not expensive. They don't take years to develop. They are fundamentally simple, low-cost solutions that just require the collective will to actually put them into practice. We could start today. So let's just quickly recap. Questionable research practices are damaging the credibility of science, mainly because there's a gap between what we know we should do and what we actually do. But the way forward is clear. Using simple, low-cost fixes like pre-registration, data sharing, and shifting our values and incentives, we can absolutely build a more trustworthy and ultimately a more useful science for every single one of us. And that leaves us with one last big question. Because this isn't just a problem for scientists in a lab. As students, as professionals, as citizens who rely on science every day, how can we all play a part in championing this move toward a more open, a more honest, and a more trustworthy science? The tools are right here. The path is clear. The only question left is our will to walk it.